Good evening and welcome to The Report with me, John Rees. US Secretary of State John Kerry and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov agreed yesterday to share intelligence on Islamic State fighters, focusing on a common enemy, even as deep divisions remained over the crisis in Ukraine. Flaminia Giambalvo has more on this story.
Here together to review coalition operations to degrade.
Military leaders from more than 20 countries have met in the United States to discuss how to combat the Islamic State, as US and Russia announced an historic agreement to share intelligence on the armed rebel group. On Tuesday, US Secretary of State John Kerry met with his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov in Paris to discuss the latest developments in Iraq and Syria. Speaking in Paris, after talks with Lavrov, Kerry said the two world powers, whose relations have hit a post-Cold War low over Russia's role in Ukraine, could cooperate together.
Mr. Lavrov and I came together here to discuss a broad array of issues and to try to find a way to recognize that where there are differences, we try to manage those differences, but that we have major responsibilities together and that our countries have an ability to be able to cooperate and work together.
But the Russian foreign minister said that the two countries had still not reached an agreement on the other issues.
Есть у нас и вопросы, по которым наши позиции расходятся, они тоже хорошо известны, и мы сегодня, в общем-то, подтвердили, что эти разногласия сохраняются.
Kerry called on Russia to do more to help fully implement a ceasefire in Ukraine between the Western-backed government and pro-Russian separatist rebels fighting in the eastern part of the country. The truce has come under strain at times since it took effect last month. The international coalition led by the US to counter the advance of the group known as the Islamic State is growing broader, with many old enemies putting their differences aside, at least temporarily. But as Barack Obama addressed leaders of over 20 countries expressing his concerns over the ongoing campaign, the prospects of victory for this unlikely coalition are still uncertain.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined by Bill Bowring, who's a Professor of Law at Birkbeck College, University of London, and Dr Halla Diyab, who's a writer, a Middle East expert and director at Liberty Media Productions. Welcome to you both. Professor Bowring, this cooperation comes about because the US is now, in an unannounced way, bombing for Assad, aren't they?
Well, I think that's exactly right. And of course, the Russians are committed to Assad and have been throughout, and not the only state to be in that position. And I think this is a sign that the Americans are absolutely forced to talk to the Russians. And of course, I'm sure they're already talking to Iran about the same topic. Even though, and we'll come to this, I'm sure, in my view, the state which needs talking to very seriously is Turkey.
Yes. Before we get on to that, though, Dr Diyab, do you think this will make any difference to anybody on the ground in either Iraq or Syria?
I think the divisions, as you said at the beginning of the report, will remain over the crisis in Ukraine between Russia and the United States. But this kind of cooperation between the United States and between Russia will have an influence on the strikes against ISIL, because Russia actually can access more intelligence information through the Syrian National Army about the ISIL situation on the ground, which can help the strikes. And also we need to question whether United States cooperation with Russia is a way to shy away from direct cooperation with Assad and with the Syrian National Army, who have more information on what is happening in the ISIL-held areas, especially in northern Syria. And we have seen that despite the strikes of the coalition on ISIL, there is progress of ISIL in Raqqa and in Kobani and northern Syria, and that shows there is a little of information.
Yeah, just let me ask you something on that, because I mean, one way you could read this is that the bombing campaign so far has not succeeded, and that the Americans need more intelligence to even make a decent show of it, don't they?
Of course, they need more intelligence information on the ground, on the Syrian ground, because the plans of the coalition against ISIL is very explicit. ISIL knows everything, knows the international plan, while we don't know actually how ISIL is moving on the ground, because now they change their tactics. They don't move in groups, and they don't actually show their flags as they used to do at the beginning of the problem in Syria. And also the rebels, the Syrian rebels, they don't have a lot of access and information on the Syrian ground as the Syrian National Army.
Okay, well, let me put some of those points to Professor Bowring. I mean, one of the problems here, and you've already alluded to it, is that the reputation of this intervention is going to stand or fall with Kobani, isn't it? I mean, whatever we don't know about what the Islamic State is doing, we know that they're about to take Kobani unless they're stopped. And if they do that, the American strategy is going to look like a shambles, isn't it, Bill?
Well, I very much like the analysis by Patrick Coburn in The Independent on Sunday, which is it already is a shambles. And this is why, and in fact, the bombing so far has had little or no effect, actually. And when you say Kobani, of course, the situation there is that, so I come back to Turkey. Turkey is absolutely not permitting the Kurds to fight with any degree of success. I mean, actually, they've held out remarkably. But what really is at stake here is arming the Kurds properly. I did see in the paper, I think this morning, British soldiers with a heavy machine gun in Kurdistan. But I repeat that the real problem actually is Turkey, which was doing serious work financing and supplying the opposition to Assad in Syria. And Turkey, in many ways, is responsible for the rise of ISIL.
Dr Diyab, that's right, isn't it, really? The Turks are the key to this. They're a NATO ally. They're sitting there watching ISIS take Kobani. If it falls, the thing is going to be in a place that it's hard to think it could recover from.
Of course, because, I mean, looking back to the jihadis and the fighters who were pouring to Syria, they used Turkey entrance to enter Syria. And they get all the equipment and the arms and the support from the Turkish border with Syria. And the Turkish government did nothing to stop, actually, these jihadis going to Syria. And yet, also, for Turkey, there is a frosty relationship between, as we know, the Kurds and the Turkish government. So
I think that's putting it mildly.
Yeah, and I think that for the Turks, it's not important actually what's going to happen in Kobani, as long as their interest, that the Turkish control over the Turkish borders with Syria is protected, and also because Erdogan's vision of having a Sunni neighbor country instead of Assad in Syria, this is his own vision of having a kind of like Turkey to champion a kind of Islamic and more states around Turkey. So Turkey has not done a lot actually to stop the growth and the development of ISIL on the ground in Syria or even in Iraq.
Do you agree with that, Professor Bowring?
I most certainly do. And I think there's another factor which we shouldn't lose sight of, which is that Russia itself is threatened. Because there has been for a number of years now and is a serious jihadist movement in the Caucasus. And ISIL is highly aware of this. And I've been reading over the last couple of weeks that there are most certainly contacts between ISIL and people who think like them in Russia. So it's no surprise to me at all that Russia is here. But I repeat that Russia is not going to be able to do anything in relation to Turkey, but the Americans most certainly can.
Do you think they will?
I think they're between a rock and a hard place, aren't they? So we'll see. I think talking to the Russians is a very interesting first step altogether. And I do agree with my colleague that actually this is an indirect way of talking to Assad.
Do you think that's true? Is that what you were saying, that they are in fact? I mean, or let's put it another way: this alignment of forces can't help but benefit the Assad regime, can it?
Are you asking me that question?
No, I was asking Dr Diyab that question, actually.
Sorry, what?
That this realignment of forces can't help, is going to, whether or not that's what they intend, is going to assist the Assad regime.
In a way, I think that the main concern of the United States and the coalition is the growth of ISIL, because ISIL it becomes a global issue and danger to the whole world, especially even for the United States or for Russia. For Russia, there are 500 Russian fighters fighting with ISIL. Imagine if some of them go back to Russia and they will empower to establish Islamic State in Russia. Especially there are a big number of Muslims there in Russia. So I think it's not about Assad now. It's about actually the danger, the global issue that the whole world is facing. However, I mean, looking back into 3 years of conflict in Syria, had the world seen this conflict growing to this stage, there should be no proxy war. I mean, because we know what was happening in Syria. It was a proxy war between, the Russian and the Americans, and they entertained this war. And, we have the same scenario happened in the 80s when Afghanistan, when they empowered the jihadis rise. And maybe this kind of cooperation between the United States and Russia now is to avoid the lesson or the destiny that Afghanistan had in the 80s.
Bill, do you think that this kind of manoeuvring by the major powers kind of degrades people's faith in international relations? Because we're getting into a kind of Orwellian world where yesterday's enemy turns out to be today's friend, yesterday's evil force turns out to be not as evil as today's evil force. It's a pretty dispiriting way to conduct politics, isn't it?
I think it's pure power politics, actually, and I suspect that it's how politics is conducted by big powers most of the time. I think there's yet another factor, by the way, why are the Russians talking to the Americans? And that is that the Russians now have a really serious situation with the Crimean Tatars in Crimea. And Erdogan has gone public on a number of occasions because of the fact there's a huge Crimean Tatar diaspora in Turkey, a couple of million people, plus 5.5 million Tatars in Russia itself. And so I think the Russians are becoming exceptionally nervous about the whole situation. And just to add to what my colleague said, in fact, Shamil Basayev, who's dead now, and Dr Umarov, and the leaders of the jihadists in Russia, they are very active right across the North Caucasus, particularly in Dagestan. And there are armed incidents and explosions practically every day in that region already. So I think the Russians are very seriously alarmed by what is going on in both Iraq and Syria.
OK, well, my thanks both to Professor Bowring and to Dr Diyab for that. But we're going to have to move on now because that's all we've got time for in that discussion. Now we turn our attention to other news.